Hello everyone, welcome to the Turkish Foreign Policy course. We will continue with Chapter 3, Turkish Foreign Policy during the Second World War. We will start this chapter with relations between Turkey and the warring parties. Then we will continue with maintaining Turkey's neutrality and the rapprochement between Turkey and the Allied powers. Lastly, we will look into the Turkish foreign policy in the final years of the war. Let's start with relations between Turkey and the warring parties. The years between 1939 and 1945 corresponded to the Second World War, an extremely destructive period in which many countries were divided into two camps, the Allied powers and the Axis powers. Against the rise of the German and Italian fascism, the Western democracies of Britain and the USA formed an alliance with the Communist Soviet Union. The Ottoman Empire had experienced the trauma of the First World War and collapsed in the early 1920s. Therefore, the Ankara government had to fight the War of Independence after the country had experienced an invasion by international forces. The new republic aimed basically to survive and maintain the nation's territorial integrity. At the core of Mustafa Kemal Atatürk's foreign policy lay the principle of peace at home, peace in the world, which was his own maxim. It is obvious that the Turkish decision-makers had deemed it a mistake to ally with Germany during World War I, and they did not want to repeat this mistake in World War II. The aggressive policies of the Axis powers, particularly those of Italy in the Eastern Mediterranean, were highly disturbing to the Turkish government. This pushed Turkey to cooperate with Britain. Despite the cooperation and collaboration established with Britain, Turkey declared its non-belligerency on the same day that Italy entered the war in 1940. Now let's continue with maintaining Turkey's neutrality. In 1941 and 1942, Turkey clearly followed a policy of balanced relations with the warring nations. For example, in January 1941, Britain suggested that Turkey declare war on Italy. This was followed by another request to wage war against Germany if Yugoslavia and Bulgaria were invaded by the German troops. However, Turkish decision-makers refused to enter the war because of Russia's attitude and Turkey's inadequate military equipment at the time. Having been both impressed and perturbed by the military success of Germany, Turkey decided to revise its close relations with Britain in 1941 to protect its national interests without frightening Germany. Thus, in 1941, Turkey was content to act in accordance with the permanent and enduring interests of the state that were mainly based on survival and territorial integrity. Italy's entry into the war on the side of Germany and the perceivable effects of the war on the borders of Turkey resulted in the creation of a physical survival strategy. At this point, instead of following an aggressive policy to meet the threat coming from the West, Turkey preferred to establish good relations with the states that were potential threats. To this end, the Non-Aggression Pact was signed with Bulgaria on February 17, 1941. The Turkish decision-makers calculated very well when to stop and when to act, and they repeatedly emphasized the smooth continuation of the Turkish-British alliance. Now we should move on to the rapprochement between Turkey and the Allied powers. When a strong power is also a sea power, a bloc may lie directly between its territory and the territory of a land power, or merely between the land power and the sea, access to which would bring the land power into conflict with the sea power. This was the case for Turkey during the 19th and early 20th centuries. It was an extremely difficult task for the British to moderate the endless requests of the Russians about the Straits while trying to convince Turkey to become involved in the war. The objectives of this task were discussed at the Casablanca Conference in January 1943. Winston Churchill came to Casablanca having prepared plans for possible Turkish entry into the war. He intended to fully support Turkey by providing military equipment. Wishing to address these reservations, Churchill told the Turkish President İsmet İnönü at the Adana Conference on January 30, 1943, that Turkey would be able to judge for itself any situation that might arise. In Adana, Churchill conducted negotiations with the Turks very skillfully, and while he induced fear of the Russians in the Turks, he left the final decision to the Turks as to whether to enter the war. When the Russians asked whether the Allies needed Turkey's participation in the war at the Moscow Conference in October 1943, the British replied there was no disagreement between them as to the desirability of bringing Turkey into the war. Following the Moscow Conference, however, at the First Cairo Conference, the British gave a warning to the Turks that they had to join the war immediately. Moreover, the Tehran Conference marked a turning point in the Allied nations' strategy toward the Turkish position. Now, not only the British, but also the Soviets insisted on Turkey's joining the war. The Soviets believed that the war would come to an end sooner with the participation of Turkey. Our final topic for today is Turkish foreign policy in the final years of the war. After the Second Cairo Conference, the British assumed an attitude of unusual coolness toward Turkey. They cancelled their military mission and limited the war supplies early in 1944. They warned Turkey in April 1944 that they would impose an embargo like those imposed on other impartial nations if Turkey insisted on sending strategic materials to Germany. The British were not alone in this warning. The United States also agreed with the British strategy. This was the moment that Turkey feared economic breakdown because of its tough resistance to meeting the demands of the Allies. Furthermore, the major concern of Turkey was that the Soviet Union was getting stronger each day, and the support of the Western Allies was its main hope for protecting itself against a strong Soviet Union. Because of the changes on the battleground, Turkey reviewed its foreign policy strategy toward the Germans. In April 1944, Turkey declared that it would stop exporting chrome ore to Germany. To satisfy the Soviet Union in particular, the Turkish government deemed it necessary to dismiss some Nazi sympathizers from their duties. Fevzi Çakmak was forced to resign from the post of Chief of General Staff by İnönü, followed by Numan Menemencioğlu, the Minister of Foreign Affairs. In accordance with this new strategy, on March 15, 1944, the wealth tax was repealed and all related penalties were abolished. So, this is the end of our program for Chapter 3 of the Turkish Foreign Policy course. Goodbye and see you in our next program, Chapter 4.